Did people bring a copy of the sutra with you? Okay, were there any copies?
Do you have the sutra open?
Oh, let's see if they're there. I think the copier is broken right now, so it's fine. We'll work with it. Yeah, we'll get some more copies, and then if you have a copy, it's best to bring one with you each time that you come in. The copier broke, so I think we have the part to fix it, but sometimes I may refer to a certain line or something. It's good if you can look at it directly, and online, it's there on the website. You can just click. I noticed there's a couple typos. I typed this out kind of quickly before the first class, but you can probably figure out what they were. So last week I had mentioned that I'd like to start out this week with a time to start with questions about anything that we've been going over so far, or things we haven't been going over, anything that's been occurring to people. And so I'm curious if there's how people have been working with these teachings, or any place where you're feeling something really alive, or feeling confused, or invigorated.
I've been chewing a lot on for lack of a better word, the logic of the Diamond Sutra, and especially the part about, I wish I had it in front of me, but I don't. Though all beings are saved, not a single being is saved. So I just like to hear more about why that is.
I'll talk more about that tonight, but so a being is not a being. That's why it's a being.
And that's I guess that's the question. That's my question. I mean, I think I get it, but I just like to hear more.
So if we think about, I really like to use the example of a tree, because I really like trees, but also there's something about a tree that is ancient in our tradition. It's where the Buddhas wake up. And so if we think about a tree, if we look at a tree, we say, oh, there's a tree. But actually, we don't really know very much about the tree. We have some idea of a tree, what this sutra and other Buddhist teachings would call the marks of a tree, or the characteristics of a tree. I think in our translation that I gave to everyone to be using, the term is attributes. So sometimes marks, sometimes attributes. The word in Sanskrit is lakshana. And so these marks are a way that our consciousness works. So we identify a tree as a tree because it holds the marks or the attributes of a tree. And the set of attributes that you might have for a tree and the set of attributes that I might have for a tree may be different. But they're similar enough that if I call something a tree, you probably, most of the time, will also think it's a tree. Although maybe it's more of a shrub to you or something, right? So on that level, we can say, well, a tree is a tree. But if we pay attention to the tree, then we'll see that actually the marks or the attributes that I use to identify the tree also become a kind of block to actually seeing the tree. I get locked in those attributes, and now the tree becomes about that apprehension of attributes. And I'm freezing the actuality of the tree with my mind to hold it as being those attributes which I identify as tree. If I look a little bit closer, maybe if you get really close to a tree, I love to smell trees. I love the smell of trees. And so if you bring your face really close to a tree like this, on the visual side, you lose a whole bunch of the attributes of a tree that you might have. You don't see any branches, you don't see any leaves, you don't see the birds in the branches, you don't see the light through, you don't see any of that. You don't see the roots as they're pushing into the ground. Maybe you just see the texture of the bark. If you look a little bit closer, maybe all you see is a little piece of moss. You have fragrance. Now those can also be attributes of a tree, but you start to see another world comes alive. That's part of the tree. If you start thinking about what are all the things about the tree that I can't see, like down underneath the ground, and where the roots go in, they start to mingle with the soil until you can't really distinguish between the very fine roots and the soil. It become indistinguishable. In that kind of invisible place, that's also the tree. And the tree's reaching up into the sky. And I'm only talking about physical things now. I'm not even talking about the spiritual qualities of a tree or the way in which a tree is always moving water and nourishment, and the way that trees communicate with other trees. All of those kinds of things. So the attributes, although they allow us to identify a tree, in a way, they're just a gateway to a possibility of not holding on to the tree as the attributes. And now a tree can become the whole world. Everything is there in that tree. So it's not a tree. It's not a tree as I would define it, or as I would hold on to it through those attributes. But it's
talking about our perceptions and our limitations of the pieces that we would see.
the perception, but not only the thing that's important here is not that there is some big tree that is outside of our ability to perceive, and we only see a little part of it. That's not exactly the teaching. That actually there's a tree that the tree itself is completely ungraspable. It's not knowable. It is not a tree. It is the total living force of all being. And so, but that's also why it can be a tree. That's also why it can show up as a tree. That's why we can encounter it as a tree. But now the tree is like a gateway, as opposed to like just a sketch in our mind of the tree. So this is a lot of what the Diamond Sutra is inviting us into, is saying, when we're thinking about beings, that first we have to consider beings and care about beings. But if we think those beings are what we think they are, then we're missing their total aliveness, which is what liberation is about. So if those beings are going to be liberated, they are not just liberated like there is a being to be liberated. Actually, the liberation we're talking about is a being realize that we are not what we think we are. We are not that limited being. We are not a self. We're not a soul. We're not a lifespan. We're not a being, is the words of the Diamond Sutra. But we identify with that again and again and again. And in identifying with that, we create the world of suffering. We create samsara. So that's the logic of it. But we'll continue to go into that. If that hook, if you want to say there's like the fish hook of the Diamond Sutra, that's it. It's hallelujah. Because you can't fix it with your head. You can't solve it with your mind. Actually, you have to solve it through this apprehension that happens through, not apprehension isn't the right word, this encounter that happens through the heart. It happens through the deep mind. So it's good for it to be a hook. I wouldn't, but let it really, because it will pull you farther and farther into the inquiry that the Diamond Sutra is providing for us. Anyone else?
So the first section,
Yeah.
I wonder to myself, why is this here?
Hmm.
And why am I reading it? And what is the importance of it?
Yeah.
It feels like a preface.
Oh,
And
yeah.
I gather that it's not a preface.
Yeah, yeah,
That
yeah.
in fact it's important.
Yeah, yeah,
But I look at it and think, I don't understand what's important about it.
yeah, yeah. You know, this is some commentators say that's the Diamond Sutra. That first chapter is the Diamond Sutra, and everything else is a commentary on this.
The first little bit where
On the
Buddha
first
went
bit,
into
yeah,
the-
yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
yeah. So I think that's a very interesting. Some commentators comment that way, and this is true of many sutras. You know, the assembly or the setting. We are so organized in our minds to extract meaning from a text. And so when we get to the part that seems like the Lotus Sutra, for example, is great for this. There's just pages of all of the different celestial beings that are there. You know, and there's centaurs and nagas and serpent kings and you know, chihuahuas would be in there too, but you know, it depends on the translation, I suppose. Just everything's there, and it can drive you a little bit like the Kegon Sutra, what's that in English? The flower ornament sutra is even more, and it's really thick, right? It's like the length of the sutra seems like the setting gets longer and longer. You know, the flower ornament's like 1,500 pages or something, and the first I don't know how many pages, so many, and this explanation of the assembly and everything. So this is I think really good for us because we're used to dealing with a text. Much of the way we deal with text is extractive of meaning. And a chapter like this really resists that. If we try to extract meaning from it, like all we can kind of get maybe is like, oh yeah, the Buddha's really chill. That seems good. Like I kind of wish I was peaceful like that, you know? And maybe we can see some other things into it, but it's fairly opaque. So we have to listen to this one, I think, much more with our imagination, much more with our heart of imagination. What would it be like to be in the presence of this Buddha? What would it be like? Could I imagine? Could I feel what it would be like to be in the presence of a being that was so settled, so straightforward, so present? What part of myself is that way? And do I sit in the assembly of that Buddha, which is right here present in my own mind all the time? In that way, it can be a kind of invitation to the assembly, which is always here with us. And yet is easy for us we want it to mean something so that we can then make our home there. But it doesn't mean something in that way. It's much more like it is very significant. It is a presentation of what it means to walk beyond suffering. And so this chapter invites us in that way. All the invitations, last week I was talking about invitations, all the invitations, there are invitations, but the invitations are alignments. They're not just like, oh, however you want to do this, cool, come on in, we'll do it your way. They're more like, please come in. But the only way you can actually walk through that gate, the only way you can really respond to the invitation is to align with the gateway that's being offered. And in this case, it's offering us some kind of simplicity, which the Diamond Sutra is not famous for simplicity. That's not what we think we're getting into when we go to it. So, yeah. Anyway, those are some tips. Yeah. Okay, well, I think I'll dive in today for what I'd like to present, and then we'll have some more time later if other things come up. So tonight I'd like to talk about the body of merit. So in these first chapters, which I really think of the first five, that's why we're studying the first five as being one cycle of the teaching. Like there's a kind of complete invitation to the Diamond Sutra in those five. So to study them well, and then to continue to study the Diamond Sutra, what you learn in the first five chapters or what you encounter in the first five chapters, then is unfolded again and again over the 32 chapters of the Diamond Sutra, and that's why I chose these first five. And one of the themes that comes through the Diamond Sutra again and again is this teaching about the body of a Buddha. And in the fourth chapter, the Buddha says, Subhuti, the body of merit of those bodhisattvas who give a gift without being attached isn't easy to measure. What do you think, Subhuti? Is the space to the east easy to measure? Subhuti replied, no, it isn't, Bhagavan. The Buddha said, likewise is the space to the south, to the west, to the north, in between, above, below, or in any of the 10 directions easy to measure. Subhuti replied, no, it isn't, Bhagavan. The Buddha said, in the same way, Subhuti, the body of merit of those bodhisattvas who give a gift without being attached isn't easy to measure. Thus, Subhuti, those who set forth on the bodhisattva path should give a gift without being attached to any conception of its characteristics. So this body of merit, why is it so important? Particularly Red Pine, this translation, he emphasizes this. In the translations that come from the Chinese, you might, if you're reading different translations, this body of merit line might not be emphasized in quite the same way, but it's definitely there in the Sanskrit, and I think it's an important way to think about the sutra. That the ungraspable body of awakening, that ungraspable body which is presented in section 1, this part that you were asking about, where the simple life of the Buddha is presented. That section is known as the cause and the reason for the assembly. It is this ungraspable body that is the cause and the reason of the assembly. The Buddha that's appearing there, his settledness, his life of awakening, it's not just some kind of graspable, settled life. It's not just a peace of mind in the way that we would imagine peace of mind. We think about peace of mind would mean like to not have any troubles, right? And that's how I would have peace of mind. But certainly the Buddha had immense troubles. He had seen into the suffering of beings. He knew acutely the deep and profound suffering that he was surrounded by. We don't expect that's what would be a mind that led to settledness, right? That would agitate us. That would be difficult. And yet here we have a picture of the Buddha who's completely aware and completely in tune with that deep river of pain, which he encountered through his own life in the most profound way. And then he encountered all around him in his students and in the society that was there, completely unprotected from it. That was his peace of mind. Not the way we think it would show up, right? It shows up in this kind of context. That body of merit is the body of a Buddha, an awakened one, that knows the body as an ungraspable thing, not even a thing. The Buddha knows the body as ungraspable. It's not quite right to say that the Buddha knows that the body is ungraspable. Okay? You see how that is? If you said the Buddha knows that the body is ungraspable, that is like a state of knowledge, where the Buddha is sitting saying, oh, the body is ungraspable, is labeling the body as ungraspable. this Buddha, which has this settled life, this total peace of spirit, that's so straightforward there in that first section, that Buddha knows the body as ungraspability. That knowing is moment after moment after moment. It's not knowing that something is a certain way. It is the deep familiarity, right, with a body which cannot be grasped. And you can experience this when we sit zazen. You know, there's no way to say, oh, okay, yeah, this is who I am. Right? Like, okay, this is my body. It doesn't go like that. If you're honest with yourself, you maybe know like 1/10% of the surface level of yourself when you're sitting zazen. Like, you know, maybe you know like, oh, my right hip hurts, right? And maybe you know like, oh, I'm glad that my left hip doesn't hurt too. You know, that's kind of the level mostly we're operating on. But the Buddha here, knows the ungraspability. Doesn't know that it is ungraspable. Oh, sure, if you asked him, he'd probably say, yeah, it's ungraspable. But the point is that there's a continual practice of knowing as ungraspable. Is not knowing as a clenching, as an apprehending, as a stopping, as a defining with the attributes and the marks, but being willing to encounter whatever it is that appears and know that it's only one face. Right? It's one side of whatever it is that I'm meeting. That's why the Buddha is so at peace. Not at peace because he's ignorant, and he's not at peace because he knows that everything is ungraspable, and he's like, oh, it will just go away. He's at peace because he knows everything as ungraspable. The body of merit is about this knowing that is not about knowing things like to be a certain way, to be marked by attributes, but to become intimate with them, to allow the intimacy of life to be the foundation of how it is that we encounter and care for things. And so this body of merit is called a punya skanda in Sanskrit. It's called a body of merit because it has the quality of liberation. It is liberated, it is liberating. And the Buddha then here calls that body of merit hard to measure. Right? It's hard to measure. Think about how it is that we measure things. We're always measuring. You know, is this good? Is it bad? Do I understand it? Do I not understand it? Whatever the measuring it is that we're doing. And the Buddha says, it's like space. Subhuti. The space to the east. Is it easy to measure? Which way? That way. Well, actually, right here, which way is east? That way. Because in the Buddha hall, the Buddha always faces south. So right here, that's south. Okay? So that's east. Right. So is the space to the east easy to measure? You know? Of course not. It goes on forever. Or at least way beyond our comprehension, is ungraspable. That's what he means by hard to measure. So this body of merit that is hard to measure, it's hard to measure because it is beyond grasp. And we can practice a center of gravity in that ungraspability, as opposed to a center of gravity in a world that we've created through grabbing onto things. And this becomes what the Diamond Sutra is trying to teach us about. What's the difference between those two bodies? What's the kind of body that I have or that I am, and the kind of bodies that I encounter when I'm finding my center of gravity in self-grasping? When my center of gravity is in the grasping after selves, then that is not the body of merit of the Buddha. That is the body of a sentient being, which undergoes suffering. We shouldn't hate that body. We shouldn't discard that body. but we should see that that is the nature of sentient beings, is to be in cyclical suffering. And so the Buddha also says there's another kind of body. That's this body of merit. Merit and good karma are those two words are very close. They're slightly different words. Punya and kusala are the words in Sanskrit. People, if you study precepts, oftentimes we talk about kusala and akusala. Kusala is oftentimes translated as wholesome or skillful, rather than good. But it oftentimes carries that kind of quality, good and evil, kusala and akusala. We usually say wholesome and unwholesome. It sounds so much like bread. It's kind of hard to use, right? But what we can see here in this merit or in good karma is that it's not something that is set against bad, right? It's not like, okay, this is the half that's good that leaves behind the half that's bad. What makes karma good or makes it meritorious is that it is karma that leads to the end of karma. Or if we truncated that a little bit, we could say the karma that is no karma. The karma that is the end of karma, that transcends karma, that transcends the transactional way of being between separate beings, where we're living in a world of transaction, of trade, of leverage, of all of those kinds of things. That this karma is a karma which liberates that. Right? And there's a corresponding body. Right? And you have that body. You are that body. So the sutra is inviting us to that. Now the source is the liberation of all beings. Right? So that's what the sutra calls the source, the true source of the Mahayana. Right? That's why the Buddha instructs Subhuti. If you want to practice, right? If you want to learn what this body of merit is like, if you want to enter into the stream of this body of liberation, then give rise to a thought. Give rise to a thought that all beings, right? And then the definition of all there is very thorough. Read that part again and again and again. It's a little bit like the first chapter where it won't just yield to your extractive meaning. It just will imprint something on you, that you have to hear with another part of your being. So that all beings are going to be liberated. That's your job, is to see that all beings are liberated. Give rise to that thought. That's the source. But that in that, if you're really going to liberate all those beings, the only way to liberate them is to not limit them to the way that you apprehend them, to the way that you hold them in your definition of what they are, what they're supposed to be. Right? And he's very precise about this. He says, any being that conceives of a being, what's our translation say here? A being, a life, or a soul. He says any being who gives rise to that conception of a being, a life, or a soul is not a bodhisattva. Right? A bodhisattva is the one that pledges to save all beings. Right? He's saying that's the source of the Mahayana. That's the source of this great body of merit. So if we're going to practice as that bodhisattva, we can't be conceiving of a being, a life, or a soul. If we do, then those beings can't be liberated because we're holding them in this different center of gravity than what the body of merit's center of gravity is. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So then he says, what is the practice of that? What is the practice of this body of merit? And the practice of this body of merit is the 6 perfections. In the Diamond Sutra, in the 4th chapter, he presents the first of the 6 perfections, which is dana, or generosity. Here we read it as giving a gift. So he says we should practice generosity, or we should give a gift, right? But we should give a gift without being attached to any of the attributes, any of the characteristics of the gift, of the giver, of the receiver. If we attach to those, we create beings out of them. And then the truth of the practice of generosity that is centered in that body of merit, right? That liberated body of the Buddha, it can't come to full fruition. Or we can't really find our center there. We stay centered in the other way. We stay centered in the life, the being, and the soul, right? Which are a form of grasping, a form of self-grasping. So, although generosity is what's presented here in the sutra, sila, or ethics, are also that you could just replace generosity with ethics. Right? Patience, or forbearance, is the 3rd paramita. Virya, or vigor, zeal, is the 4th. The 5th is samadhi, or meditation, concentration. And the 6th is prajna, or wisdom, which animates all those others. So when we're reading the sutra, there is this invitation to this body of merit. There's an identification of where is its source, and then there's the presentation of what is the practice of that source. How do you actually do that? How do you save all beings without making a conception of a being? And the Buddha here says, give a gift. That's how you do it. There's these other ways too, but we can just talk about give a gift. Actually, dana is always on the first of the list. Yeah. And part of that is because it's the most immediate. And I think really the most powerful. Right? It underlies all the others. And when you give a gift, you can think about this in really very like a practical way. If you give something to someone, you have to let go of it. Otherwise, you didn't give it to them. Right? And you might even let go of it physically, but it's unlikely you have let go of it emotionally or mentally when you give that gift. There will be something, right? You know, like a hope for a thank you. Maybe even it's as small as that. Or hope for special recognition or favor. So, how do you give a gift without being trapped in any of those things? You know, he's presenting this practice. Well, the way you do it is you give a gift and be trapped by them. And then you can discover how you're trapped by them. If you wait until you could give the perfect gift in which you would not be trapped by any of these things, you will never give a gift. So the invitation is really great because it's like just do it, right? You practice it, and in the practicing it, you see your own limitation. You get to see your own grasping after a life, after a being, after a soul. And when you see your grasping after those things, you can see how they keep the center of gravity in the cycle of suffering, as opposed to this body of merit, which is free and liberated and simple. Not because it's ignorant, but because it doesn't try to know the river of pain as a thing that it has to deal with. It is just simply intimate with the aliveness. So, let's talk about a little bit about these words, these things that we grab onto, right? Which he's warning the bodhisattva to not place in the center, or not to conceive of, or not to hold on to while you are giving a gift. So I'm not sure why Red Pine only used 3. That's why I have to keep looking back at it, because usually it's 4. being, life, and soul in this translation is what he uses, but in both in the Sanskrit and in the Chinese, there's usually four there. Sometimes translated as self, person, being, living soul. There's many different translations, but we'll go through each of them a little bit. The first one in Sanskrit is called Atman, and you'll be familiar with this. Is one of the central teachings of Buddhism, is on Atman. So many types of spirituality, particularly in South Asia, they will give the a teaching that there is like a real you. There's like a center of your being. It's called the Atman. Right? And you probably heard this if you read Siddhartha, or you practice yoga, or read any kind of Asian philosophy. But the Buddha said the teaching was anatman, which means no atman. That there is no essentially permanently abiding self. Right? And so this first thing he says that we shouldn't grasp onto is this, sometimes we, like a Musong, one of the commentators that I mentioned in the first class, calls it the organizing principle of ownership. Like, if there's a self, then there's others. And it becomes the organizing principle of how it is that we relate with all other things. Everything becomes a self-other relationship once we have a self. Right? So it's one flavor of self-grasping. I guess that's what we could say. Right? Pudgala is the second one, oftentimes translated as person. And in this case, oftentimes we could say it has to do with a self that's in an environment, right? The Atman is a sense of my own self-being, right? My own, I am me, right? And Pudgala is, I am in relation with other beings, I have a role, and that's myself, right? So it's just a different level of self-grasping. The Atman may be very kind of like personal. And then when we get to Pudgala, it's like my role in the world. And then when we go to Sattva, which is also translated as a being, then that's something like our sense of the subject and object. Where Atman is focused on like my being, and then the objects appear. The Sattva is like there's always this me and the other thing. Always a subject-object relationship is defined. And then the last one is jiva in Sanskrit, oftentimes translated as soul. Although if any of you are inclined towards Jungian psychology, don't think of this as the same as the soul of Jungian psychology. It's just what they're talking about. Soul, in that context, soul has to do with the everythingness that shows up within your individual consciousness. In this case, the soul has to do with like a total buy-in to the idea that you're an independently abiding self, right? That your soul is your soul, like it will leave your body and go into something else later. That kind of idea of a soul. Musong has a really so that's all kind of abstract. He has a way of talking about this that I really like that I'll share with you, and then we can play with it in some other ways. He says that the first level of this self-grasping is the unexamined assumptions of a life. That's how he describes the Atman, the unexamined assumptions. So what's he talking about there? You think about, in philosophical terms, it's called naive realism. You're just walking around in the world, not thinking about things too deeply. It pretty much seems like there's just a bunch of things knocking around that are real. And you're one of those things that's knocking around that's real, and you're walking around and you're just seeing things. Like there are things out there and you're just sensing them. And they're real, you're real, and things are just how they appear. In that kind of world, the Atman seems really obvious. I'm just me. I mean, I go like this. When I go like this, Jakwan's finger doesn't do this, Unless I say that, then maybe he gets a feeling like, oh, maybe I'll do it too, right? It's just like, it's very, I'm me. I'm just me. I'm not you, I'm me. It's so obvious. But if we examine that a little bit more, we start seeing all the ways in which that's not true. I mean, I have a sense of being me, but my sense of being me is not the only thing that's present there. The only reason there's a me here is because there's all these other things which have led to there being a me. Even my perception that I'm a me came through a very complex set of relationships. Babies that are do not have any contact with other humans, they don't develop consciousness. Not in the way we think of consciousness. It's they really are permanently damaged from a human perspective. So it takes the interaction. If you see parents with their children, they're constantly like, oh, they cooed, ooh, there's a constant back and forth, constant back and forth, constant back and forth. That's not just because the baby's cute. I mean, it's because the baby's cute. But the reason maybe the baby's cute is to get you to do that, right? So that this consciousness can develop. And that's just one little thread of what's happening for the development of our sense of me being a being. Or for those of you who have raised children, it's drop the cookie on the floor. Oh, Dad picked it up. Sweet. Drop the cookie on the floor. It's like, oh, Dad picked that up. Sweet. And you can see there's this whole formation of a sense of who am I, right? Based on what activities I'm doing and how the rest of the world reacts to me. So what I'm saying is that is a very complex event made up of all kinds of causes and conditions which lead to me experiencing these things which I think are just simply there, and I'm just simply here. Like people thought the earth was flat. Mostly Europeans thought the earth was flat, actually, at a certain time called the Dark Ages. Because there's some things you can do that make it kind of obvious, like get in a tall place and look at the horizon and it goes like this, it's not so, so complex. Look out over the ocean. But why is that easy? Why is it easy to make that mistake? Well, because the earth feels flat to us. Because in any given place, we're on such a big sphere that it's, for all intents and purposes, if we're building a building here in the backyard, we don't have to think about the curvature of the earth to set the foundation, right? We can just make straight lines, or what we assume are straight lines, right? They're straight for us. So I'm kind of going on and on about this, but this is so easy for us. We just slip into that world. Even if you're kind of philosophically minded, or you're meditative minded, or you've deconstructed some of this stuff, you live there. You live in that world of unexamined assumptions. Moment in, moment and moment again, We get what we want. So that level of our kind of organizing principle, unexamined assumptions. He says that the second level, which is often translated as person, he says these are the linguistic usages of unexamined assumptions. So now we have the word self, we have the word me, and now we can construct a narrative about there being a me and there being a you. So that story about there being a me and a you is not the immediate experience of just like, well, yeah, I'm me and you're you. And there's all those things out there and I'm right here. But now there is a whole story, right? We have a language which binds together our experience. It creates centers of reference. It creates symbols of truth. It weaves everything together in narrative. And he says that's one way to understand what it means to be a person, right? If the first one is self, then the person is what shows up in that linguistic usage. And then he says on the third step, there's the firmly held beliefs based on the linguistic usage of unexamined assumptions. So he says we have the unexamined assumptions. Now we have this whole story about the unexamined assumptions. We have words for it, like me and you, right? And now we have these beliefs, right? And this is what he's saying is this sattva, or being. We have deeply held beliefs about what the significance of me being me and you being you is. So the textures of our values, the textures of or the shapes of our heart become defined by that. Our cultural frameworks for understanding what it means to be a me and a you becomes embedded. And then he says when we get to the last one, oftentimes translated as soul, he says that's identification with such beliefs. So we don't only have the beliefs, we now have an identity which is formed by that system of beliefs. Now, I'm going through this tonight not because you're going to remember all that, or I want you to remember all of it, but because it's a gateway to examining something that's presented in the sutra. He's presenting what is self-grasping like. It's not just as easy as one side of the self-grasping. Like, oh, I'm being really selfish right now. There are many, many layers that work in all kinds of facets of our life. Right? And so here there's 4 that are used to explain. There could be 6. There could be 27. Or you could just say self-grasping. But when you just say self-grasping, you have a tendency to think you know what it is, or that you could know what it is in a kind of singular way. And so the sutra breaks it apart and says there's all kinds of ways that you're going to need to understand what self-grasping is about. And so here's 4. And if you could try to understand those 4, then you could see that it comes in many, many flavors. Those 4 can create, how many colors? Was it 3? We get 3 primary colors in black and white, and then we get everything from that? I mean, I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what they say anyway. So it's kind of like that, right? You got 4 versions of self-grasping, and you can create all kinds of self-grasping. So, again, the Buddha is saying, a bodhisattva does not conceive of these things, does not conceive through these things, does not use this as the basis of conception. Okay? Now, I think it's really important when we hear this to not think, oh, I conceive of those things, therefore I'm not a bodhisattva. It's not about saying, am I a bodhisattva or not a bodhisattva? It's about what part of you is doing what. Of course you're a bodhisattva. And of course you're not a bodhisattva. Both are true. So when we hear this part of the sutra, it's the invitation again. Where are you going to find your center of gravity? What are you going to entrust in? What are you going to use for the basis of practice? When you use the part where you're buying into these various forms of self-grasping, then you will experience the life of a sentient being. The kind of limitations and the kind of suffering that come along with that. But that will teach you about the grasping. It will teach you about the limitations that are part of our cycles of pain. And in learning about that, we can then learn about the ungraspable body, the body of merit that is pressed right up against all that suffering. Remember, the first thought is the thought that all those beings will be awakened, that they will all be liberated from the suffering. A bodhisattva can't have that thought unless a bodhisattva is pressed up against that suffering, not rejecting it, saying, oh, that's what the bad people do. I'm a bodhisattva. I have nothing to do with that. But a heart which is completely attuned to that grasping. So this hard to measure body of practice is this non-conception of a being, a life, and a soul. The hard to measure body of practice is the non-conception of a being, a life, and a soul. It is the non-conception of this self-grasping. how do we practice that? We give a gift. But we give a gift that goes beyond. So I think most of you are familiar with the mantra at the end of the Heart Sutra, Gate, Gate, Paragate, Parasamgate. This is said to be the central mantra or the central dharani of the Prajna Paramita. And it's right there it's the heart of the heart. And the perfection of wisdom, or the Prajna Paramita, that's the sixth perception in the sixth perfection. Sorry, the sixth sixth perfection in the sixth perfections, and it's the one that animates all of these practices. And it's always about going beyond. Gate means go beyond. So gate, go beyond. Gate, going beyond. Paragate, go completely beyond. Parasamgate, go perfectly and completely beyond. Bodhisvaha means hail awakening. So the instruction there is that all of those practices animated by prajna, generosity animated by prajna, is to give a gift, to go beyond that limited self-grasping that shows up in all these different layers. So we give the gift. We may feel the self-grasping that comes with the practice of giving the gift, and we step beyond. And as we step beyond, our center of gravity shifts fundamentally from that narrow grasping self to this body of merit that is hard to measure. It doesn't have any edge. We can't manipulate it. We can't create it. It simply is. So there's one last thing that I want to read to you, and then we have time for a couple questions if people have them. This is one of my favorite things in the Buddha Dharma. I maybe can say that about a lot of things, but I love that about favorites, is you're allowed to have more than one. I didn't used to understand that. My wife, when we were, before we were married, when we were boyfriend and girlfriend, she said, "Oh, this is my favorite." And then, next day she'd be like, "This is my favorite." And I would be like, "But yesterday you said this was my favorite." And she was like, "Well, yeah, but now this is my favorite." And I thought, I would be like, "Oh, well, you can only have one favorite." And then I wisened up. You can have as many favorites as there are moments. So now this is my favorite. This is called the 10 Qualities of Space. Just as space is not produced, does not age, does not suffer death, does not pass out of existence, does not come into existence, cannot be forcibly handled, cannot be carried away by thieves, rests on nothing, is the pathway of birds, presents no obstacles, is endless. So also nirvana is not produced, does not age, does not suffer death, does not pass out of existence, does not come into existence, cannot be forcibly handled, cannot be carried away by thieves, rests on nothing, is the pathway of the noble, presents no obstacles, is endless. So this is a description of nirvana. This is a description of the body of merit that is hard to measure. This is a description of the body of awakening, which is not abstract. It is actually the very straightforward experience of living. Is not produced, does not age, does not suffer death, does not pass out of existence, does not come into existence, cannot be forcibly handled, cannot be carried away by thieves, rests on nothing, is the pathway of birds, presents no obstacles, is endless. It's comparing it to space. That this is the river that the Buddha knows so well, and why he can appear with such ease. May have been a bit muddled, but if you have any questions, I'd be happy to respond. Uh-huh.
I, for a long time, have been struggled with the English word body. And I think because I immediately think of like a human body, or the shape of a body. Right? And I realize that must be included. But I really, whenever I hear body of merit, I think of a body. But is punya, I think, is it?
Punya means merit, and skanda is what's translated as body.
In the Red Pine commentary, his own commentary, there's a word that skanda is related to, which is like a pile, and like a pile is like a pile of sand, but also like a constellation, like which is like it's stuff, but also a lot of space. Can you? I mean, I suppose a human body is like cells and atoms, which is like stuff in space. But can you maybe talk a little bit more about that dynamic, sort of like that word body, and why? You know, sometimes it's like it comes with so much that it sort of lose. Totally. And you can talk a little bit more about the choice of that.
So Red Pine's translation is, like I said earlier, is very, it's distinct in his deep emphasis on body. And he makes that choice for several reasons, I think. The term skanda here is rarely translated as body. It's usually, a skanda is that's how we describe the components of a being. So the 5 skandhas are thought of as heaps. That's the typical translation. They're like, here's 5 piles of things, and those 5 piles of things are usually what we experience as ourself or other beings. And but he makes the point that that's one way to interpret it, but it also can mean like an emergent thing. It's more like it's like piled up, but like a mass of things that are stuck together. That's another way of thinking of skanda. I think he stretches it a little bit for the purposes of some of his other insights, but I think they're important, and that's why I like to use it, because we are so attached to body. It's one of the primary ways that we experience Atman, or the unexamined experience of self and other. And so to think about, well, what is that body of awakening? This was also the question has been a question of Buddhists for a long time, and one of the responses to that was these attributes of a Buddha, which were the 32 marks of awakening. So the sutra is definitely working with that. What's a Buddha look like? What does awakening look like? What is awakening formed of? How would awakening show up in the world? That's a really important question. So in that sense, I think body is a good word, but I think also important to unhook it just from our sense of human bodies, but also as an invitation to the investigation of our own embodiment, which is so much. There's so much powerful inquiry there within our tradition, particularly for practicing meditation, that we can find out very quickly that this thing which I thought was just me, and that it is confusing to me when I don't have control over it, that it's actually obvious that I don't have control over it, because it's not graspable in the way that I assume it would be as being mine, right? I think it's mine, and so it would be controllable. So in that sense, I think really staying close to the meaning of body, which is a physical form, gives us some avenue to exploring our own experience. Because there is so much space, even if you don't think about the physical, like what did they say? How much we are water? 70% or something. I don't know. People say different percentages. I don't know if it's true, but just like how much water there is and all this other things that are going. Even if we don't go into that physical sense of it, think about the space of within your body, which is just your mind. Like you could say your awareness. If you bring if you sit and then you bring your awareness down into your like your chest, there's a whole world there. Which is not can't just be subsumed in my simple idea of this body. I don't know if I'm making any sense, but I think that's a direction where using this term can really bring us in. In the Chinese, they simply say merit. They don't say body of merit. They just say this merit is hard to measure. They just say like that. They don't say the body of merit. Because that probably that term punya skanda, the heap of merit, just got translated as merit. Mm-hmm.
I have a question about this last slide
Mm-hmm.
of section 1 in the Diamond Sutra.
Mm-hmm.
After touching their heads to his feet, why is that?
Why did they touch their heads to his feet?
Yeah.
So the conventional explanation would be that this is the sign of respect for their teacher. And so this would have been a tradition to touch your head to the feet, to walk around 3 times with to bare your right shoulder and to walk around 3 times and then to sit down to one side. That was a way of showing respect. I once had a student when I was teaching in Japan who was an exchange student from India, and she said that every morning, very devout Hindu family, she said every morning when she woke up and when she would leave her room, the first thing she would do would be to touch her forehead to her father's feet. And this was, 10 years ago or 20 years ago, I forget, when I was at teaching school in Japan, 25 years ago. So that continues today. Culturally, that's a kind of sign of respect. And when we make prostrations and we put our head to the ground and then we lift up like this, the symbolism of that is that we're offering the Buddha to stand on our hands, and we would lift him above our heads. Yeah, or whatever it is that we're prostrating to, or to each other when we're prostrating, that has that meaning. So that's a kind of conventional understanding, which I think is important for us to get, like that part of it. And then I think there's another part where it starts to enter into our mind and our heart in another way, which is what is that activity of touching our head to the feet of the Buddha? Not just as a kind of, culturally that's what they do, and maybe I would try it if I was in that situation. But like, what is it? What is that? What is it to do that? What is it to prostrate? Is this submission? I don't think it is. it is something like deep respect. Is something like receiving. It's something, I think it's like maybe the only way to really receive is through that level of humility. So those are just some of my reflections about it, but I'd encourage you to work with that and think about what is that, and in your own, when you make prostrations, what is that like when your forehead touches the ground? What do you know there that you can't know without doing that? Dogen Zenji calls the prostration the great dharani. The great dharani of awakening. The great incantation of awakening is prostration. There's some records of ancestors that in their temples, you can go see, apparently in China you can go see, I forget which ancestor it was, he's really famous for prostrating. And then they've preserved the floor where he prostrated, and it's like his knees and his elbows and his forehead, there's indents in the wood in those places. And I think at first, maybe we need to prostrate a lot because we have a lot of self-grasping, and it's kind of medicine for self-grasping. In fact, Suzuki Roshi said that, the founder of San Francisco Zen Center and the lineages that come out of that. They all, after in their morning service, they always do 9 prostrations at the beginning and end. You usually do 3. That's the typical, is to do 3, but they always do 9. And the other day I was in a meeting, we were talking about some of those things, and the head of our order in North America, who knew many of these monks who were, founded these places, he said, "Oh yeah. Because Suzuki Roshi thought Americans really needed to prostrate more." so he said, we're going to do 9 at the beginning and 9 at the end. Even though it's typical 3, we probably need to do more here to get things aligned. I think that's really true. So anyway, that practice of prostrating this is really important. But one thing to point out about prostrating, and you can read this in this here too, is you go down and you come up. The prostration is not only the going down part, right? There's the going down and there's the coming up. There's giving up of self, right? There's giving up total veneration, and then there's the standing up and walking around, right? And that's equally part of the prostration, that our own position, our own role to play, our own endeavors to save living beings are informed by being willing to press our head to the ground or to press it to the Buddha's feet. But we get up and then we do those things, and then we press our head to the ground again. And that becomes the prostration. So I oftentimes think when we're prostrating, like actually all of life is a prostration. And half of it is the going down and half of it is the coming up. And so both of those are involved. Yeah. But our tendency is to think that it's just the going down. Okay, next week I'll make sure we have some more copies available during the class, and I was hoping tonight that we would recite the sutra together, so we'll start with that next week, and then again have some questions and presentation.
Did you say we can find that on the website though?
Yeah, it's right on the, if you go to the website and there's the little, you just scroll down and there's all the different things that are happening at the temple. In the one on the Diamond Sutra, like the entry on the Diamond Sutra, you just click on it and there's a PDF that's on there. Yeah. You could, I don't know how much merit you get for printing out many copies of the Diamond Sutra as opposed to copying them, but I'm sure there's some merit involved. I mean, I don't know how there couldn't be. We should make a page where it just like is writing the Prajnaparamita sutras over and over and over. Like it's not just there, but it's like continually. Could you make that happen, Michael? Is that we'll talk about it tomorrow. We've talked about those things before.